I'm going to give you some general advice about carbohydrates, and then I'll go into a little more detail about what I mean. Now, this category of macronutrient has always been the basis of our calorie intake because carbohydrates represent relatively quick energy. The body has to do less work to retrieve the energy of carbohydrates than it does to retrieve the energy of fats and proteins. Fats and proteins are more complicated molecules. Carbohydrates are relatively simple molecules, and there's less work that has to be done to liberate that stored chemical energy and turn it into glucose, the basic energy currency of the body. I would say that adult women probably need to eat about 225 to 270 grams of carbohydrates a day. Men need somewhat more, maybe 288 to 345 grams. And most of this carbohydrate should be in the form of less refined, less processed foods with what's called a low glycemic index. And I'm going to have a lot more to say about this. Glycemic index is a new way of rating carbohydrate foods by looking at how fast they turn into blood sugar. Carbohydrates fall into two general categories, sugars and starches. In the past, nutritionists have played up this distinction. Sugars have been called simple carbohydrates, starches have been called complex carbohydrates, and we've been told that we should eat more of the complex and less of the simple. That turns out to be not a very helpful distinction. A much more helpful distinction is looking at how quickly carbohydrate foods, whether they are starches or sugars, influence the level of glucose in the blood. Glucose is blood sugar. That has enormous implications for our hormonal balance, our calorie balance, our metabolism in general, and our long-range susceptibility to chronic illness. If we look at the history of the relationship between human beings and carbohydrate foods, we can see some very interesting changes that have taken place. In the first place, the invention of agriculture, the domestication of cereal plants, brought grains, which are major sources of carbohydrates, into the human diet and really enabled the rapid rise in human populations, which led to modern civilization. But for most of human history, the ways in which people treated grains resulted in carbohydrate foods that converted relatively slowly to blood sugar. The easiest way to make a grain edible is to parch it. That is simply to dry toast it. And this is still done in many parts of the world. I lived for a while in Peru, and in Peru on every table you get a bowl of parched corn, usually salted parched corn, and often these are giant kernels of varieties that are grown down there. So this is simply a dry roasted grain that you can eat. You can also crack these roasted grains. You can cook them with water to make very coarse gruels. You can bake them into chewy, grainy breads that have cracked particles of grains in them. All of these preparations of carbohydrates have relatively low glycemic indexes. That is, they turn relatively slowly into blood sugar. And some of this is for purely physical reasons, that if you've got a big particle of a whole grain, it takes a long time for digestive enzymes to penetrate that. And especially if part of the fibrous coating of the grain is still present, it slows down the enzymatic conversion of that starch to blood sugar. But in modern times, we have developed methods of stripping off the fibrous coating of grains and milling the starch into superfine particles that have an enormous surface area so that enzymatic digestive action takes place very rapidly. When we eat flour, and it really doesn't matter whether it's whole wheat flour or white flour, when we eat products made from these flours, breads, muffins, pizza crusts, pretzels, chips, crackers, all of this kind of modern refined carbohydrate has very high glycemic index. It converts relatively rapidly into blood sugar. And this has a very different impact on metabolism than the old-style carbohydrate foods that were predominant in the human diets until relatively recently. Now, what is the significance of glycemic index, of whether a food causes a slow or a rapid rise in blood sugar? When foods that we eat cause rapid rises in blood sugar, the pancreas is called on to secrete insulin. Insulin clears sugar from the blood. Sugar is actually quite toxic circulating around the blood, and it's important to get it out of there and into cells where it can be burned for energy. And that's what insulin does. Insulin allows sugar to enter cells where it can be burned to release caloric energy. But if your diet is high in these high glycemic index forms of carbohydrate, and if you have a particular genetic constitution which is quite prevalent in human populations today because it enabled us to take advantage of calories when they were available, these spikes of sugar followed by spikes of insulin secretion over time result in a phenomenon called insulin resistance, where cells become resistant to the effect of insulin. In its extreme form, this results in adult onset or type 2 diabetes. But in milder forms, insulin resistance is probably the basis of a great deal of the obesity epidemic that we see in America and other Western countries. It's also a cause of high blood pressure, of unhealthy patterns of fats in the blood that can be associated with increased risks of heart disease, and with many other derangements of metabolism that can result in chronic disease. We are seeing today not only a very alarming epidemic of obesity in children, but we're also seeing an epidemic of adult onset diabetes in children, something that's new to medical science. In fact, this is becoming so common that people suggest that we may have to change the name of this disease to teenage onset diabetes. It's no longer an adult disease. In southern Arizona, where I live, this became very apparent in the Native American population here. Quite recently, the youngest age that I've seen it diagnosed at is 7, but it's common between ages of 9 and 10, often preceded by several years of very serious obesity, sometimes beginning at age 4. Clearly, this has to do with a dissonance between a certain kind of genetic constitution, which many of us have. These have been called thrifty genes, genes that enabled us to take advantage of calories when they were available. And many of us have evolved from populations that lived near starvation or had feast and famine kinds of eating. We've inherited these thrifty genes that are great to have if you're living near starvation or food is available only occasionally, and become a real detriment if food is available all the time, and especially includes a lot of these high glycemic index carbohydrates that turn very quickly into blood sugar. So if you've got this genetic constitution, as many of us do, and if your diet, as it now is for many of us, is very high in refined carbohydrates, you are at risk for developing insulin resistance and all of the medical problems associated with it. For that reason, I say that the majority of carbohydrate calories that you eat should come from less refined, less processed foods with low glycemic index ratings. You can, by the way, read up on glycemic index in a number of popular books that are out there, and you can find tables of glycemic index so that you'll get a sense of this. In general, it's a good idea to eat some of these low glycemic index carbohydrates with most of your meals, and that includes whole grains, beans, vegetables, low glycemic index fruits, which are generally temperate region fruits, especially berries, apples, cherries, peaches, pears, apricots, as opposed to tropical fruits like mangoes, papayas, pineapples, which tend to have higher glycemic index. And the reason that you want to take some of this low glycemic index carbohydrate in with each meal is that it helps balance any higher glycemic index foods that you may be eating. If you're going to eat a high glycemic index food, let's say you want to eat a waffle made of flour, white flour, whole wheat flour, and you want to put some maple syrup on it. These are relatively high glycemic index. You can balance that by adding some low glycemic index foods at the same meal. Blueberries have a very low glycemic index, so if you put a generous helping of blueberries on top of your waffle, you've created a more balanced carbohydrate meal that's going to have less of an impact on blood sugar and on insulin secretion. Another way that you can reduce the impact of high glycemic index foods is to make sure you're eating plenty of fiber with the meal, because fiber slows down that digestive conversion to sugar. Acid does as well. Lemon juice and vinegar added to foods that you eat reduce that digestive conversion. There are some carbohydrate foods out there that I would really warn you away from today. Read labels to avoid foods and beverages sweetened with high fructose corn syrup. This has become a universal sweetener in America today. It's an unhealthy sweetener, and the foods that contain it tend to be low-quality foods. You're better off using less of them. And don't use pure granulated fructose as a substitute for table sugar. It's supposed to have fewer calories, but it is not a healthful sweetener. The body has a very poor ability to handle fructose. It may have unbalancing effects on liver function and fat metabolism. In regard to bread, you are much better off eating breads that are dense, chewy, that have pieces of grains in them, peasanty breads, rather than fluffy breads, whether they are dark or white. If you want to eat pasta, pasta actually tends to have a lower glycemic index than bread because it has a denser structure, and you can make pasta more healthful by not overcooking it. If you eat firm pasta, what Italians call al dente, to the tooth, rather than mushy pasta, you're better off. You are better off eating small, waxy potatoes rather than large, floury potatoes. You're better off eating basmati and converted rice rather than sticky, regular rice. And you want to try to get more beans in your diet. Beans are very high-quality foods. They have low glycemic index carbohydrate along with other nutrients that you need. So I think these recommendations apply to everyone, but particularly if you're at risk for insulin resistance, meaning if in your family history or your own history there is adult onset diabetes, obesity, cardiovascular disease, elevated blood fats, serum lipids or triglycerides especially, or if you have low good cholesterol, the HDL fraction of cholesterol, high serum triglycerides, a tendency to gain weight in the abdomen, a tendency toward high blood pressure, all of these are indications that you've got these thrifty genes that make it especially important for you to learn the differences among carbohydrate foods. So remember, carbohydrates are quick energy. They're the basis of calories in your diet. Between 50 and 60% of your total calories should come from carbohydrate foods. But you really want to learn the differences. You want to try to cut down on the refined, highly processed carbohydrate foods. And that means all the snack foods that have become so prominent in the modern diet today.